bringing the people behind our food to life.
Today I'm making a honey sweetened apricot lavender butter, and this is one of my favorite preserves because it really highlights the flavor of apricots, which are one of my favorite seasonal fruits. It's not heavily sweetened, so you get all that honey flavor, all the apricot flavor, and then the lavender is just kind of singing in the background, so it's really a delicious one. All right, we're gonna wash the apricots first. Just gonna give them a quick rinse and drain like that. I'm just going to slice them in half. One of the things I love about working with apricots is that they're really easy to prep. So often you get peaches and you have to struggle to get the stones out or really work to get them ready or peel them. Apricots don't need any of that. They're just chop and they're ready to go. One of the things that I found about apricots too is that in recent years, the ones you get at grocery stores don't have a lot of flavor on their own. And so by just cooking them with a little bit of honey and lavender, you can take even the most mediocre apricots and make them amazing. Often I will buy apricots from farmers that are seconds as well, so they're not perfect, and that's okay. They don't have to be perfect to do something like this. You can really get the ones that have a few marks on the skin or have a little bruise. You can always cut that bruise out, and it really doesn't matter, and it won't affect the finished flavor of your butter. So once these are all pitted, I'm just going to cut them into quarters and then put them in the pan with the honey. Another great way to preserve apricots is instead of making them into a butter, you can actually can them in halves like you would see peaches at the grocery store. And I love to do it in a honey syrup as opposed to in a sugar syrup because, again, you get that gentle sweetness from the honey and they just feel more virtuous when you do it with honey as opposed to with granulated sugar. So I'm going to cut all of these in quarters. Our apricots go straight into the pan. So now we're going to add the honey. And when you're picking a honey to use for preservation, you don't want to get the most strongly flavored honey available. You want to really pick something that's a little mellow, a little mild. You don't want to overpower your preserve with the flavor of the honey. So this is a blackberry honey, and so we'll get a little blackberry flavor from it, but it won't overpower the apricots. And in fact, I feel like it really will complement the apricots nicely. Pour our honey over the apricots. And so what's going to happen now is they're just going to sit for a few minutes, and the honey will start to pull the juices out of the apricots. They'll start to mellow out a little bit, and once this fruit starts to soften, we'll be able to turn the heat on. While those sit, I'm going to measure out my lavender. And so we're going to use a culinary lavender. You want to make sure whenever you use a lavender for a preserve like this one that you get one that isn't too soapy in flavor. And so you'll typically buy it at a grocery store or from an online herb shop, and those places will be selling you lavender that is designed and prepared for culinary use. You don't necessarily want to pick the lavender right out of your yard if you don't know what kind it is, because instead of giving sort of a floral note to the finished butter, you could end up with something that tastes a little soapy, and you don't want that. And you don't want to waste those beautiful apricots. So I have a length of cheesecloth, and it's about 2 teaspoons is what you want. So I'm just going to dust a little bit of lavender into the cheesecloth and then bundle it up. So just like that. It's not a big bundle. And then I'm going to tie it in a knot. And the reason you put it in a cheesecloth as opposed to just, scattering the lavender right into the preserve is that the lavender gives you really good flavor, but it's really unpleasant to bite down on the little lavender buds once they're in the preserve. I tried it once. I tried to see if I could make a jam that had the candied lavender right in it, and it was weird. And I gave it to some people, and the feedback was that they loved the flavor, but having little flower buds right in their jam was not what they wanted. It wasn't their jam. So I have my little lavender bundle here, and this is starting to soften up a bit. And so I'm just going to tuck my lavender in here. And as it cooks, the apricots will release their juices and it'll saturate that little lavender bundle, and you'll get so much flavor from it as it cooks through. The fruit has been sitting for a few minutes now and it's really started to soften. The honey is dissolving, and so it's time to turn on the heat, and we'll start it at low and start to soften the fruit even more and cook it into the butter. And basically I'm going to leave it alone until it starts to simmer a little bit, and I'll stir it every couple of minutes to make sure that we don't develop any burning spots. But it'll cook over low heat for 15 to 20 minutes until the apricots really dissolve and break down, and they just kind of turn themselves into butter. You don't have to do a lot to them to really get a beautiful consistency. So the butter has been cooking for about 8 minutes now, and the apricots have really broken down. This time is going to vary a lot depending on whether your apricots are really ripe or a little bit harder. I had kind of a combination, so we've waited until they've all softened up. And so you can see now that they are really tender. They're starting to dissolve. There's really kind of a syrup. And so at this point, what I like to do is go in with a potato masher just to help them break down a little bit more. A potato masher is one of your best tools when it comes to lots of jams and chutneys and pizza sauces, anything where you want to be a little lazy with your chopping and then come back to it later once it's softened with the cooking and break it down. So I love a good potato masher. I'm just gonna use it to encourage our apricot pieces to break down even more into the syrup that they have released and made in combination with the honey. I really like to wait till the end of cooking or near the end of cooking before I go at it with a potato masher, because the thicker you make the product, the more splashy it becomes. It's like when you make tomato sauce and all those steam bubbles have to work harder to break the surface. The same thing happens in your preserve. And so this is going to be pretty hot because it's got honey in it, which is a sugar, and so you don't want to burn yourself with splashing apricot butter all over the place. So I wait till towards the end before I start to break it down like this. All right, and we know that this is done. It's not quite there yet, but I'll know it's done when I can stir it and pull a line through and the space stays open. So it's not quite there yet, but another 2 or 3 minutes and it'll be really thick and perfectly buttery. Now I like to leave this as more of a chunky butter, but if you wanted a perfectly smooth apricot butter, once it's finished cooking, you can scrape it into either a large heat-proof measuring cup and use an immersion blender to really puree it, or you can scrape it into a blender and puree it that way. If you do the blender method, you've got to be careful because it's going to release a lot of steam, so you always want to put a towel over the top of the blender so that you don't burn yourself and it doesn't kind of splatter out. So take care if you do it in a blender. I like to do it in a measuring cup with an immersion blender because I feel like it's a little less messy and you don't run that risk that you're going to sort of have a steam explosion. Plus, it's easier to clean, and I'm all about things that are easier to clean. And so for me, cleaning my blender is more of a pain than cleaning an immersion blender or hand blender. Another way that you can tell that this jam is getting near to the end of cooking is that when you stir it, when it's sat for a moment and then you go in to stir it, it really sizzles like fervently, vehemently. And so I'll give it a second and I'm gonna stir. It's not doing it so much, but it is keeping that space now, which is what we're really going for. So when I stir it, I clear a space and it stays open. We are so close to it being done. Got a little burning there, not burning, really sticking. So if you've got a spot that starts to stick, you want to really scrub at it with your spoon so that it doesn't turn into a burned spot. All right. So I flavored this butter with lavender because I love the flavor of it. But you could also do this with ginger. You could grate in some fresh ginger, or you could dice up some crystallized ginger and add that at the end of cooking, and that would be really nice. This is one too that if you wanted sort of that holiday seasonal flavor you could do with cinnamon and nutmeg or allspice and go kind of that flavor profile. So this is a very flexible preserve. And one of the nice things about these little batches is that you can make one batch with lavender, and then a few days later when you have another couple pounds of apricots, you can make another batch with vanilla. It just, you can keep playing with it and changing up the flavor, which is great. All right, I am gonna call this done. So anytime a preserve like this is done, as soon as you turn the heat off, you want to keep stirring for another moment or two, because what that does is it helps the last of the steam escape and allows it to tighten up a little bit. So it'll just thicken a little bit more. You can also see that, again, this is not quite as thick as you might think you want a butter to be, but that's okay. You don't want to take it to the point where it's super thick when it's hot, because as it cools, it'll thicken up a little bit more. So if I were to cook this to the point where it's as thick as I want it to be when it's cold, it would be cement if it was, you know, once it cooled down, because it would just firm up so much. So we're going to can this in my little teeny tiny batch canning pot. It holds 2 half-pint jars. And so this recipe will make about 3 half-pints. And I always think of that as 2 for the shelf and 1 for the refrigerator. All right. So when it comes to canning, there are a few tools that I really like to have on hand. One is a wide mouth funnel, because it's going to help me get the butter into the jars without making a big mess. The other is this tool you just saw me use a moment ago. It's called a jar lifter, and it's simply a curved wide pair of tongs that allows you to lift your jars easily and get a good secure grip on them and not break them, which is always a good thing. And then the third tool is called a lid wand. It's just a plastic stick with a magnet at the end, and what it does is it allows you to get the warmed lids in and out of the hot water and not burn yourself and not scratch up the inside surface with tongs. Now it's time to fish out the lavender bundle, and I'm just gonna use my spoon to pull it out, and I'm just gonna set it in the sink. If you're feeling really ambitious, you can get a pair of tongs out and really squeeze every last bit of apricot out of it. I don't bother. All right, so it's time to fill our jars. I'm just gonna fill them up. When you're filling your jars, you want to go to about 1/2 inch worth of head space. And what that means is that as the jar is full, and this one probably needs 1 more spoonful. As the jar is filling up, you want it, you want to make sure that the top of your product comes somewhere in between where the continuous thread overlaps. So you can see there's this little overlap there, and the top of my product is right in between. Got 2 perfectly full jars. Put my wide mouth funnel in the sink. I like to just tap them on the cutting board a little bit to help settle the preserve in the jar, make sure there are no air bubbles in there. And then I'll just wet my finger and get a little bit of the preserve off the rim of the jar. All right, so these have been in the water, so they're nice and warm. And the reason they need to be warm is you want to make sure that the sealing compound here gets really soft, so it'll give us a good seal. All right. And then I'm going to grab my rings, and when I put these on, I just tighten them to the point where they meet resistance on the jar. I don't use all my force to get them on there, because the oxygen that I've just trapped in that headspace is going to escape during the processing time, and we want to make sure that there's space for it to get out, because that's what creates our vacuum. And so if there's no space for the oxygen to escape, they won't seal properly. So I'm going to grab my teeny tiny canning pot and move it over here on the burner, and I'm going to lower my jars into the water. In they go. And when you put your jars in the water, it's okay to stack them, which is what I'm about to do, and you want the water level to come up about an inch over the top of the jars, which it is right here. So you don't have to have one of these little pots in order to can. Any stock pot or pasta pot with a strainer insert will work well. You just want to make sure that you put something at the bottom of the pot in order to protect the jars from being in direct contact with the heat of the pan. So this pot has a little rack in it that you can see, and it allows the jars to be protected from that direct heat. Now, I'm going to turn this on. Before I turn it on, I'm going to wipe up the apricot jam I spilled so that I don't burn it onto the burner. Got to keep cleaning as you go. And grab my lid and turn this guy on. As soon as this comes to a full rolling boil, we're going to start a timer for 10 minutes, and that's how long the jars need to process to be shelf stable. I've still got some left in the pan, and I'm just going to scrape it into another jar so that I can put this one in the refrigerator and eat it over the next couple of days or weeks. It'll last a while. And you can already see that this is really thickening up as it cools. I just can't get over it. How pretty is that? I love it. So the timer tells us that the jars are done. So I'm going to turn the heat off and remove the lid. And as soon as the water cools a little bit so that it's not at a rolling boil anymore, I'm going to reach in and grab the jars. And hopefully they will start to seal almost immediately. And so often jars, when they're sealing, will make a little pinging noise or a pop or a snap sounding, and that's totally normal. That's actually a great sound to hear because it means that your jars have sealed and they are shelf stable. But if you don't hear that popping noise, you can also tell that they're sealed because the lid will go a little bit concave, and when you push on it, it won't wiggle at all. This one, actually, that one's sealed without making a noise, and that happens too sometimes because that's already firm and concave. So this one is still not quite there, but there's not a wiggle, but it's convex still, it's not concave, and so that one's still in the process of sealing. So once these jars seal, they are shelf stable for about a year. I will tell you that preserves sweetened with honey don't last as long as preserves sweetened with sugar because sugar is a really powerful preservative. So I like to can this one in either these half-pint jars or even smaller jars to ensure that when I have a jar that's open in the refrigerator, I'll be able to eat it before it starts to get moldy. And so you don't want to do this one in large like pint jars unless your household goes through a lot of jam or fruit butter in a pretty quick amount of time. But that's our fruit butter, our honey sweetened apricot lavender butter, one of my favorite preserves from Preserving by the Pint.